The Communist International and the Popular Front Marxism is the theory of the emancipatory movement of the proletariat. Lenin, the revolution was and continues to be a confrontation between different ways of living in a certain historical context. 3. Congress of the Communist International. The survival of the type of reformist organization expresses that the process of conscious elevation of the masses towards the position of the communist vanguard is necessarily gradual, which does not occur at once through a single political act for the whole class, the constitution of the Communist Party, for example, but of several historical events, constitution of the Communist Party, plus the revolutionary conquest of power, plus the fulfillment of the tasks of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Thesis of reconstruction of the Communist Party Marxism was born with the recognition that in the proletariat, for the place it occupies in the capitalist mode of production, the conditions are met so that, for the first time in history, class emancipation can coincide directly and unequivocally with the emancipation of all humanity. And this is not because of a supposed spontaneous solidarity that brings it closer to the rest of the oppressed bourgeois and sentimental idea, that is, ascientific, but because capitalism organically interweaves all social functions with production to such an extent that it is no longer possible to separate the subversion of wage labor from the revolution of the whole of society. This axiom, at the base of scientific socialism, that with the historical emergence of the proletariat it is the practice of an oppressed class that, for the first time, directly supports an increasingly integrated and intertwined world, implies that a decisive and revolutionary change in that practice cannot fail to completely upset the entire globe, with consequences of historical universal importance. This double circumstance means so much that the proletarian revolutionary program appeals to all the oppressed in the world as well as that its dimension is by nature international and internationalist. The ability of the revolutionary proletariat to immerse itself in the historically given world and transform it, consciously project revolution, is nothing more than the test of the 9 of its internationalist vocation. Precisely, the October cycle shows how the proletariat has already been able to come out of itself and merge with the determined world of the time, including that vast peasant and colonial periphery of the civilized world of the time, radiating communism towards the West and the East. 1. This is so to such an extent that the history of the Soviet proletariat and the Communist International, founded a century ago, is the story of the universal beginning of this leaving itself, which rules the way for the rest of the proletarian experiences of the October cycle and for the communist future that the conscious proletariat still has to build, resuming the work whose outcome depends exclusively on itself, on ourselves. And it is that there is no automatism or essentialism that can replace, as at any other stage of the revolution, that rebellion of freedom against what the world has made of us, and that in our current situation only materializes as a side-taking, free and voluntary, and against the tide. For the reconstitution of communism, Lenin himself, in the heat of the struggle to constitute the Third International on the sidelines of and against the social chauvinist and Kautsky leaders of the Second International, emphasizes the role of the will of the vanguard by saying that precisely because it is a difficult work, it must be carried out only with those who want to do it. 2. Such is the deep content of the red thread and the secret of history, that only with the emergence of the modern proletariat does it get rid of its clothes of Hegelian ruse to lead to the movement that annuls and overcomes the current state of things, and communism as a work of conscious free construction that begins here and now. With this we enter headlong into what constitutes the necessary political structuring of that logic, the avant-garde mass dialectic, concepts that are not watertight, but mobile as stages of the revolution or its preparation are being stirred. And this is nothing other than the means by which the avant-garde can merge, progressively and concentrically, its revolutionary worldview of Marxism with the historically configured world, whose transformation depends on the revolutionization of the spontaneous practice of the class that sustains it, precisely from the vault of revolutionary ideology and its political referencing as an emancipatory horizon. In this way, just as in the constitution of the local communist parties, a whole series of stages and tasks between the primitive vanguard nucleus that takes the initiative and the large masses of the class, The Communist International is also constituted, effectively, from above, from the vanguard and from the international projection of its project. We can proudly say that in the first Congress we were, in the depths, only propagandists, that we limited ourselves to throwing fundamental ideas, a call to the proletariat around the world, a call to struggle, and we asked, where are men capable of following that path? Now we have an avant-garde proletariat everywhere. If only some propagandists could make those fundamental ideas resonate all over the globe, it was, first of all, for having behind him the immortal deed of October, that emergence of the subject that showed that those who until now had been humiliated object of history wanted and could become owners of it and, therefore, of their destiny. It is this international political referendality, guaranteed by the rupture of the imperialist chain in one of its weak links, that already made it possible to decisively project communism towards the worker of the West and the peasant of the East. In turn, this places the international as the form of a qualitatively superior and more complex stage of the world proletarian revolution, subsequent, both logically and historically, to the constitution of the national section that manages to militarily defeat the bourgeois state and institute the dictatorship of the proletariat and that, consequently, part of the existence of at least one socialist state to be taken into account in the further development of the world revolution. This projection deployed in the CxR, then, the maximum horizon of the maturity of the proletariat as a revolutionary class and one of its strategic keys, irreplaceable and unincomparable when developing the RPM comes to the fore. But, precisely because it was up on the shoulders of the first triumphant communist revolution, it had to necessarily share the paradigm on which the Bolshevik Party in Russia was articulated, to the point that the history of the IC is unfailingly linked to the history of the Soviet proletariat. This double consideration, its political material substrate and its subjective conscious projection, is essential to correctly place the World Communist Party in its historical place. Given this circumstance, we will address, fundamentally, the material structure that supported the CI and the necessary limitations that led to the strategy of the Popular Front first and its self-dissolution in 1943, leaving in the background the conception of the world that was at its head, because, without prejudice to further analyses that can be carried out within the framework of the balance of the October cycle that the Reconstitution line proposes at the forefront, its main lines are fundamentally outlined, and here we will give them, to a large extent, as supposed. 4. In turn, and despite the fact that the RPM and the IC, as they were articulated in October, were the fusion of the proletarian class struggle of the West with the peasant war of the East, we will focus, fundamentally, on Western Europe, where the key to the reason for the crisis of the HF and its populist front degeneration, and whose deep motives go back to the period of development of the labor movement prior to its jump as a class for itself. 1. The material premises of the Communist International 1.1. Exhausting an era in the middle of a fratricidal war, although a whole specific study of the period 1871 to 1914 is necessary, we can summarize its significance, in an abbreviated and provisional way, as the time of preparation of the October cycle, in particular, and the material conditions of the RPM in general. The Social Democratic International, a revolutionary party that does not make the revolution, not only contributed the bulk of the ideological corpus on which the entire October cycle was held, with a strong evolutionary and economicist imprint, but also laid the historical and material conditions for communism to be deployed as a world horizon and could be immersed, from that historically articulated Marxism, in the concretion of the world of its time, a jump that necessarily had to be made. Contradictorily, against that base, but also from it. If October marks that political moment of rupture and opens the door to a more complex and rich phase of the RPM, the previous 30 years of social democracy provided the material substrate on which the proletariat was able to affirm its historical maturity. This exercise of prospecting the accumulated experience of the class and conscious projection towards the future is none other than the one carried out by Lenin at the time of rupture with the Second International. The Bolshevik leader, after reviewing the period of the First International as the forge of the common tactic of the proletarian struggle of the working class for the different countries, describes the era of social democracy as an era of incomparably broader development of the labor movement in all countries of the world, a time when this movement had to be deployed in extension, leading to the emergence of socialist workers' mass parties within each national state, the exercise of historical synthesis of the bourgeois revolution and elaboration of the program of the proletarian revolution by Marx and Engels corresponds to the intensive task of demonstrating the role of the working class in the depths of the world created by capital, as well as its potentiality. The Second International, on the other hand, fulfilled the extensive task of affirming the proletariat within that world that was only a byproduct of the bourgeois revolution, in a downward line since 1848. And the logic of the bourgeois revolution, which had to take Marxism as the only possible materialistic and historical starting point from which to open the way to the intellectual demonstration of the need for the proletarian revolution, is none other than the mass-state dialectic. Hence, at this time, the working class had to assert itself through mass parties as a historically developed way of interacting with the whole of the correlation of classes, that is, with the state as an organized force. A milestone that has been preserved as the proper form, likewise, of mature capitalism. Indeed, it must be taken into account that, when the large social democratic parties and unions proliferate, the normal model of the bourgeois party resembled a party of notables more than to modern mass parties. Significantly, it is with imperialism and the passage of social democracy to the ranks of reaction when the bourgeoisie assimilates the mass party as the way par excellence of articulating its political domination, which not only speaks to us of the need it has to sustain its domination with the support of increasingly wide layers of the population, but also, and more immediately, of the character of the bourgeois state to digest, as a reactionary synthesis, the political forms that initially emerged outside of it. It is this logic that made possible the historical betrayal of social democracy and definitively elevated the mass-state dialectic as the direct and piloted form of political articulation of the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie through large mass parties as the logic of the imperialist state. 6. Thus, the growing interconnection and mutual dependence between the state and social democracy, the working class organized in the large national unions, closes that period in which the proletariat had to rise to national class, which results in its transformation into a key political piece that the bourgeoisie needs to take into account to organize and maintain its dictatorship. Now, their relationship, unlike in the previous history, is no longer external, but, without being identical, the extension of the spontaneous mass movement coincides fundamentally with the extension of the machinery of organized violence, the national state, which tends asymptotically as its ceiling and culmination without being able to overcome it as a form of social articulation. In this way, the emergence of the imperialist state goes hand in hand with its growing dependence on the masses to sustain itself politically, to the point that a crisis in this mediation whose epicenter does not have to be located directly in the proletariat. See the Dreyfus case can trigger a broad political crisis. In turn, spontaneity is integrated as a mechanism of adjustment and improvement of the state, both of the configuration of the class alliances that constitute it and of the development of its vast technical, logistical, and military apparatus. The split of socialism into two wings was consummated, in 1914, in the form of a dilemma between reinforcing those transmission belts and signing the sacred union of the proletariat with its national bourgeoisie or, on the contrary, breaking them, given that, for the first time, it was enough to pull a thread to undo the whole skein. And just as during this process of settlement of the modern configuration of the state, eloquent symptoms of where social democracy was heading, its necessary outcome was the transformation of opportunism into social chauvinism at the outbreak of the First Imperialist World War. Lenin is aware of the change of era that the imperialist war entails in terms of relations between the working class and the state, and that materialized dramatically in the persecution of the internationalist left and the exaltation and promotion, by the bourgeois states, of the work that the social chauvinist leaders and their newspapers carried out among the working class, encouraging it to the fratricidal war. It is no coincidence that it is at this time when the Bolshevik leader directs his most forceful paragraphs against any attempt to make the masses of the class, immersed in chauvinist excitement, the reference axis of proletarian politics. Let's cite some eloquent examples: the deaf indignation of the masses, the confused aspiration of the oppressed and backward layers to a good peace, the protest that begins between those below. All these are indisputable facts. And the more the war is aggravated, the more they encourage and the more governments have to encourage the activity of the masses, exhorting them to the spirit of sacrifice and to put their forces in extraordinary tension. The mechanism of political democracy acts in this same sense. Nowadays you can't go without elections, nor can anything be done without the masses, but in the era of the printing press and parliamentarism it is not possible to carry the masses behind without a widely branched, tremendously methodical system. I would call this system Lloyd-Georgism, by the name of one of its most eminent and skilled representatives of this system in the classic country of the bourgeois workers' party. A common sophism of Kautskyism is to refer to the masses, saying that it does not want to separate from them or their organizations under capitalism. One cannot seriously think about the possibility of organizing the majority of proletarians. Secondly, and this is the main thing, it is not so much about the number of members of an organization as about the real, objective, meaning of its policy, whether that policy represents the masses, serves the masses, that is, it serves to free them from capitalism, or represents the interests of a minority, their reconciliation with capitalism. 10. What is in the spotlight is the political independence of the vanguard from a mass hegemonized by the opportunistic and chauvinist leaders, who enjoyed the support of their respective bourgeois general states. That is the minimum condition that the Bolshevik establishes to maneuver politically. The independence of the vanguard from the spontaneous movement as a condition of the construction of the revolutionary movement. The center of the process, in short, is no longer in the masses and in their spontaneity, but in the vanguard nucleus from which the new type Workers' Party is constituted and in its revolutionary direction towards communism. That is the skein of the skein, or, if you like, the decisive link of the chain that can transform the more or less spontaneous crisis of the existing state into the starting point of the proletarian revolution. This is what happened, indeed, in Russia. The fundamental core of the internationalists in Russia is Pravdism and the social democratic working class minority of Russia as a representative of the advanced workers, who reconstituted the party in January 1912. That fundamental core, that minority, arranged a vault of understanding of the historical trends of the world that she had to live. Pravdism, that is, revolutionary Marxism, Bolshevik at this time, and the system of straps that links it to the key nodal points of Russian society, some very small but important industrial nuclei in a peasant sea, and within them the leaders that the labor movement stands out from its bosom, was the minimum to, creatively relying on the political conjuncture, radiate communism to broader spheres of society, conquering, and in concentric circles successively, to sectors each increasingly far from that first vanguard segment as they feel questioned by revolutionary agitation and propaganda. It is a movement that engenders revolution as it engenders itself, landing in the conjuncture without losing this essence or interrupting it under any circumstance. While the slogan of the Kautskians was first to end the war and then make the revolution, the Bolshevik attitude is diaphanous. That crisis and that mood of the workers must be taken advantage of by the socialists to agitate the people and accelerate the sinking of capitalism. 1.2. A revolutionary avant-garde in every corner of the globe, the international deployment of the communist subject and its logic, as we have been saying. The consecration of the great mass workers' parties was, at the same time, the consecration of that sector of the class, the basis of opportunism and social chauvinism that Marx and Engels called gentrified workers and Lenin workers' aristocracy, promoter of reform and social peace as a means of converging the unionized masses with the great industrial and financial bourgeoisie, reinforcing their national state and providing it with a greater social base. For this reason, that self-affirmation of the vanguard as a decisive instance of communism had to go, necessarily, through the split of the socialist parties that grouped and framed the organized sector of the class as a premise to build a revolutionary mass movement. 13. But only in Russia had that superior unity of the vanguard been conquered with the masses, of the social democratic working class minority with the advanced workers, of the Communist Party that was the key to the vault that made October possible. In Western Europe, on the other hand, the Bolshevik feat radiated communism and catalyzed, when it did not begin, the split of the revolutionary elements of the old socialist parties, demonstrating the material and universal dimension of the revolutionary subject, capable of resonating and generating communism even where it lacked direct settlement and organizational ties. That is, in fact, and as we have been pointing out, the premise of the Constitution of the Three International, very far from that Two International, more similar to a coordination table of national socialist parties than to a world party of the revolution. The International consists of the mutual rapprochement of men capable of truly defending socialist internationalism in our difficult days, that is, of grouping their forces and shooting in response against the governments and the governing classes of their respective homelands. It is acceptable to emphasize how Lenin does not define the Communist International in exclusive or mainly organic terms, but as a movement, as a mutual rapprochement. Moreover, the Bolshevik leader takes care to very clearly delimit the logical political moments that articulate this movement. In the first place, it places the ideological approach of the various sensitivities of the internationalist left, of the sector of European socialism that opposed the war and that aspired to bring Red October to Europe. That is, that it aspired to the violent revolution against the bourgeoisie immediately. This tells us about the avant-garde mass relationship that was established between the Bolshevik Party and the rest of the groups of the revolutionary left. As in the local, state communist parties, the IC, the World Communist Party, it is built starting at the top, by the national section that carries the revolutionary theory invigorated by the embodied waters of October, what would become the general line of the revolution, whose depository is the IC itself. It goes through the approach and elevation of its masses towards it, in its multiple phases, and concludes, in its time, with the relevant organic structure, subject to the political needs of the revolution, including the military. The construction of the IC, like the construction of the party, consists of a series of tasks that cover the entire historical era of transition from capitalism to communism. Nothing further, then, from the politicking and combating of revisionism, even in its international version of the unity of the communists, which sees nothing but organization and distribution of armchairs. On the contrary, the CI in it is worth as an example of the degree of maturity of the revolution that requires its reconstitution. Far from being the simple result of an intersubjective agreement, with all the implications of voluntarism that it entails, part of the emergence of a global revolutionary movement and its objective elevation towards the position reached by the national detachment located at the head of the RPM, after having broken the imperialist chain by one of its weak links. This, of course, and by the way, does not mean rejecting the cultivation of relations between groups of communists that, even at the time of preparation of a new RPM cycle, as is the case of our time, are on the left of international communism, because a solid international culture of revolutionary avant-garde, to the extent that it can be built, can only place us in a better position to take steps beyond the ideological approach when the time comes. Lenin thought about this invigorating role of socialist culture when he pointed out how the dilated and solid traditions of the German labor movement, cultivated for 3 long decades, and being the flagship of international socialism, made it possible for him to be the first to reorganize after the imperialist war, even despite the betrayal of social democracy. 15. And this not to mention that in the example of the SPD, all the leaders of the internationalist left who broke with social democracy, including the Bolsheviks, were politically educated. But it was also in German lands where the initial rejection of the Bolshevik call to constitute the Third International had to emerge, and that found a voice, mainly, through Rosa Luxemburg and, After the bloody murder of her and Karl Liebknecht for the reaction, Hugo Eberlein, although he would also be the one who, shortly after, would formalize the entry of the Spartacus Group into the Three International as KPD. The background of this opposition has traditionally been explained by the Polish's reservations towards the Russian model of revolution and its future entronization, as the only possible paradigm of the revolution European insidiously exploited by the bourgeoisie. However, from a materialistic and Marxist point of view, the initial opposition of Spartacism responds, rather, to the fear of separating from social democracy and, therefore, from the organized masses and encouraging the split of the labor movement, probably because of that same broad socialist tradition of the German proletariat with its own inertia and peculiarities, including the long years of accumulation of forces and workers' unity as the premise of the revolution. Think that Rosa Luxemburg, already in 1912, had addressed Kautsky urging him to stop the disputes between Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, since they were infecting and disorganizing the ranks of the entire European socialist movement. These two examples would be enough to emphasize the full depth of the constitution of the IC as a long-distance political process, mediated by multiple milestones and with various tasks to be fulfilled. The first, as seen, of ideological demarcation, of clarification of who wants to make the revolution and with what plan he is willing to do it. The constitution of the Communist International was not something guaranteed or considered conquered. It is enough to think that its first Congress had met, at first, as a conference, and only in the course of its sessions does it decide to be instituted as the Third International. German casuistry, as well as the relations of the Spartakists with the Bolsheviks, only emphasizes the fundamentally heterogeneous character of the labor movement of each country, with its own traditions and material dynamics, byproduct and echo of the local particularities during the period of conformation of the proletariat as a class itself and, also to a large extent, of the place occupied by each state in the entire imperialist chain, and that communism must necessarily take into account to articulate its concrete political tactic in each country. But it is that, precisely for that reason, for being a byproduct of an inherited order, created without the concurrence of the subject, given, the national peculiarities are located below what has already become the only vault from which communism can be postulated as an effective force, the horizon of the world revolution and the transformation of the exploited proletariat into emancipated humanity, that is, the universal subject. With the advent of imperialism and its distribution of the globe, there are no longer national traits strong enough to detract from the universality of a unique and global strategy of the proletariat. And, as it could not be otherwise, revolutionary Marxists were aware long before October that opportunism and revolution were already more or less internationally defined fields, two classes, two conceptions of the world, two opposing lines. See the famous first footnote of the What to Do. That essential work for anyone who considers the construction of the revolutionary movement from the conscious factor. In the history of modern socialism, it is perhaps a unique fact, and extraordinarily comforting in its kind, that a dispute between different tendencies within socialism has become, for the first time, from national to international at present. English Fabians, French ministerialists, German Bernsteinians, and Russian critics are a single family. They praise each other, learn from each other in close ranks against dogmatic Marxism. Will it be in this first contest that the international revolutionary social democracy will be strengthened enough to end the political reaction that has prevailed in Europe for a long time? When the Bolshevik directly links the international ideological struggle within socialism, what we would call two-line struggle today, with the relaunch of the proletarian offensive in Europe, he is giving us the key to the profound significance of imperialism and the era of the RPM. For the first time, the conscious and subjective projection of the proletarian revolutionary program, including the planning of its theoretical class struggle within the vanguard, can trigger the revolution of the whole of the target world. Communism must take into account, of course, the local circumstances to land on them and equip itself with material packaging. The state continues to be the basic form of social articulation, with all the territorial discontinuities and particularities that this implies, and all the more so in imperialism, which is nothing other than a system of states and unequal development. But that landing in the particular conjunctures has as its premise, precisely, the perspective of its revolutionization and, therefore, the general line of the RPM. That is why the Three International is structured as central agencies plus the national sections and organization chart in which the whole is more than the sum of the parts and not as a federation of parties, since each local communist party effectively constituted expresses the mediation, the link, the connection between the global strategy of the RPM, its international vanguard, and the specific conjuncture of the country in question. Moreover, it expresses the elevation of the proletariat from its local traditions and peculiarities to a practice of new plant, revolutionary and universal. Only in this way can the proletariat neutralize national differences and the different state political rhythms, erecting its own strategic and international body that, as it develops and takes root in more and more corners of the globe, with each local communist party and with each triumphant proletarian revolution it sets the conditions to be the basis from which the nascent communist civilization swallows the system of states of imperialism and, with it, the class society and the fragmentation of humanity by national fences, a process that encompasses the entire stage of transition, the entire period of the socialism. That is the mature, developed form that assumes the fight between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, and between its two superior weapons, the party and the state, respectively. 1.3. The rugged landing of communism and its necessary limitations, the adherence of some national peculiarities to the communist movement of each country is essentially linked, in the history of the Third International, to the historical moment of the leap of the proletariat from class itself to class for itself, a jump in which, as we have repeated to the point of satiety, the traits of the previous period are preserved because they are the only materials that the subject had at hand to deploy. This circumstance, in Russia, was decisive in opening the October Revolution, because there came together the bourgeois revolution in progress, an objectively revolutionary economic struggle of the proletariat, given the context of absolutism, and in vanguard, Bolshevik, which decidedly the horizon of the proletarian revolution and the dictatorship of the proletariat. 18. On the contrary, in Europe the working class had long been consolidated as an economic class and, culminating and periclitized its ascension curve, its struggle of spontaneous resistance was disabled as a platform to strategically link it to communism while it had already become part of the new imperialist normality, expanding the distance between masses that objectively were located in these terms of class and itself, national, and a communist vanguard that moved subjectively on the international level of class consciousness to itself, opened in 1917. However, this does not mean that the working masses in Europe were insensitive to communism. Just as October splintered into the international socialist vanguard, he also spurred the masses exhausted by the war to direct military confrontation with the bourgeoisie. Despite the bourgeois myths about the passivity and disinterest of Western European workers in communism, the years from 1917 to 1923 are punctuated by electrifying insurrectional episodes in which armed masses even take power temporarily, as in the case of the ephemeral Soviet republics of 1919 in Hungary and Bavaria, which was not even founded with the participation of the communists. 19. And this is not to mention the German revolutions of 1918 and 1921. But these experiences were not triggered as a result of the development of the economic resistentialist struggle of the masses, a logic that was demonstrated, and proved inoperative. On the contrary, the masses spontaneously take up arms and reach the dictatorship of the proletariat through the integral questioning of the bourgeois order, recognizing in the October Revolution the only alternative to a world whose miseries and contradictions had been dramatically exposed by the war. Bolshevik communism does not enter Western Europe through the Union, but through the direct opposition of the two-class dictatorships, bourgeois and proletarian. That's his baptism of fire. Although there is probably part of the truth in attributing the failure of the revolutionary attempts of this period to a naive faith of the communists in the immediacy of the world revolution, and to an underestimation of the stability of the capitalist states motivated by an economicist catastrophic analysis of the post-war conjuncture tells us about the extraordinary weight of the ideological premises of the Second International and Bolshevism, the main reason for the inability to sustain in time the various flashes of proletarian dictatorships in Europe is, fundamentally, material, the lack of an organic link between the vanguard proletarian and the working masses, of genuine communist parties capable of translating and materializing this general tactic of the world revolution, whose depository is the IC in the specific political circumstances of their respective states. The Bolshevik contagion, the emergence of revolutionary subjectivity, could not, in the first instance and because of this circumstance, generate more than nuclei of revolutionary vanguard separated from masses framed in the social democratic parties, already fully integrated into the bourgeois state. Communist vanguard and masses face, in Western Europe, as independent and already configured quantities, and, especially in the case of the masses, with particular political traditions long settled, different between the different countries. This separation is not, of course, something that arises at this moment, but has to do with the historical nature of the October cycle and the period of its preparation. And it is the political logic on which the Three International is deployed and articulated. It is no coincidence that Lenin has to direct, in 1920, the childhood disease of leftism and communism to that European vanguard tending to subjectivism and unable to find the appropriate political mediations to land among the bulk of the class, landing that she herself aborted with retarded conceptions such as the opposition of the dictatorship of the masses to the dictatorship of the bosses. 21. The very urgency of the moment, of defending the revolution and taking advantage of an explosive international situation, impelled the eradication as soon as possible the ideas that prevented the vanguard from taking land and leading a mass movement on the offensive. But, because of its own structure, with its spontaneous birthmark as it takes off in October, the vanguard could not but develop and take to its peaks the historically inherited political mechanisms, leading an already given movement, in line with the paradigm on which the cycle was articulated. The defeat of the leftist positions, a disease of growth of the revolutionary movement, is endued in the elevation of the vanguard and its conscious initiative as the decisive element for the revolutionary development of the masses, but in the only possible way at that historical moment and in accordance with the material structure of the subject, shielding the organization of the avant-garde, including its externality with respect to the mass movement, to preserve its autonomy and ability to maneuver. That chasm between the communist vanguard and the working masses of Western countries was being understood, increasingly, as an unquestionable, insurmountable, and even necessary condition of the proletarian revolution. It is at this moment when it roots the organist conception of the party, which reduces it to the organization of the avant-garde, as opposed to the Leninist model of the party as a chain of links, as the avant-garde plus its transmission belts with the masses. The problem of the construction of a revolutionary movement of a new plant was replaced by the problem of directing the organs of resistance of the working class, and as such it is picked up by the IC. Strengthening the union of the party with the masses means, above all, linking it more closely to the unions. All the tactical elaboration of the CI for the different countries throughout the 20s is due, fundamentally, to this deep division between the vanguard and the masses, starting with Lenin's exhortations to the British communists, and the two Congress of the International, to enter as a fraction in the Labour Party or the tactics of the single front. Although the famous 21 conditions of the Comintern could serve to preserve the moment of the split, and even stimulated by offering a certain vault of organizational independence for the vanguard, for the leaders of the IC it was obvious that the young European communist nuclei, with the partial exception of cases such as the German one, lacked the experience of ideological combat and party construction that the Bolshevik Party and Russian revolutionary Marxism had behind them. And it could not be otherwise given that the open front of the RPM forced the accelerated burning of the tasks related to the forging and education of the communist cadres called to atomize the weapons and develop the European Revolution. These are the main problems that obstructed the rationalization, understanding, and full transmission of the practice of the new type Workers' Party, as the Bolshevik example had already developed it. It does not happen like this, on the other hand, and as we have seen, with the experience in the military frontation with the bourgeoisie and in the attempts to establish proletarian dictatorships in Europe, an experience in which a good part of the cadres that will later form the communist parties, if not these parties themselves, had a certain baggage, having participated directly in those battles. The IC functioned as an essential transmitter of the Bolshevik revolutionary political culture and experience, offering the new parties their own skill in political and organizational matters. But the Comintern, as we say, knew how to transmit better the more directly organizational experience, derived from a seizure of power that was supposed to be immediate, with all the technical, logistical and military baggage it requires, and the majority of this aspect from the point of view of the insurrectional paradigm, than that related to the construction of the Revolutionary Party of the Proletariat, a deficiency that Lenin, in the 4 Congress of the IC, bitterly points out by describing the colloquially called Bolshevization resolution of the Third Congress as Russian almost to the core, so much so that almost no foreigner will be able to read it. This duality, suffered by the IC as well as by its European sections, only responds to the historical need for the dictatorship of the proletariat to emerge and be rationalized before the theory of the new type Workers' Party, a need already pointed out on multiple occasions by the LR. The direct consequence is that the avant-garde will be much more familiar with the rhythms and logics of the struggle for power, with the conquest of the state as an immediate end and, often, last end of the masses of the class as a platform towards it, than in the management of the new type logics that characterize the Communist Party as a set of social relations and as a germ of communism, which already points beyond class society and, therefore, the state as non plus ultra of the articulation of society. The dictatorship of the proletariat, for being still a state and for carrying the seal of the split of society into classes, cannot, by itself, transcend this determination, in the same way that, by themselves, the armed masses cannot stabilize their violence as a new power, as demonstrated by the dramatic collapse of the European workers' insurrections that followed October. It was through the democratic bourgeois Lane's mass-state dialectic for which he necessarily had to tear up the locomotive of the proletarian revolution during the October cycle, and if this happened so it was because of the entry into the scene of the key qualitative mechanism that is the Communist Party, capable of quantitatively stretching that historical dialectic inherited from the bourgeois revolution, but not of organically merging with it, precisely because it is an external object to it, pre-existing. Although that space of negativity could open the time of the RPM, it was in turn the main obstacle to building the Communist Party as the core axis of the RPM. It may be for this reason that, next to the principle that revolutionary Marxism has been defending from the experience of the Paris Commune about the proletarian dictatorship, the insinuation of the possibility of building the dictatorship of the proletariat from the parliament, from the existing state already crept into the 3 Congress of the IC, a government of that type, of the type of the dictatorship of the proletariat de l'art, is only possible if it arises from the mass struggle, if it is supported by workers' organizations fit for combat and created by the largest sectors of the oppressed working masses. A workers' government arising from a parliamentary combination can also provide the opportunity to revitalize the revolutionary labor movement. 26. In the mid-1920s, communism was unable to sustain in time the not few, although brief, experiences of proletarian dictatorship that had been taking since 1917. If the masses could momentarily seize power, the proletarian vanguard could not give it continuity or link the tactic of the IC with the various local political conjunctures. The 1920s demonstrate, firstly, the general tendency of imperialism, given the sharpness and depth of its political crises, to spontaneously generate power gaps that can be directly occupied from below by the masses, but, secondly, and against any spontaneous insurrectional illusion, they point to the indispensable role of the vanguard to give a revolutionary path to political crises and the power gaps that they can generate. In other words, its transformation into a point of support for communism can only come from above, from the Communist Party. The inability of the proletariat to achieve it could only become in its gradual demotion towards the existing state as the axis of revolutionary action, either in its reformist front populist version or in its insurrectional version, which also presupposes the state as a separate entity from society and its conquest as a central moment of the revolutionary process. And it is at this moment that the old illusion, already criticized in its day by an old Engels, of a masses spontaneously organized and barricades capable of taking power and sustaining it in time, or of generating spaces of counterpower solid from themselves, accuses all its limitations. The failure of the revolution in Europe not only testifies to the historical exhaustion of insurrectionism, it also consecrates, to that extent, and for the moment only negatively, the vanguard as the decisive instance for the construction of the dictatorship of the proletariat. This already points to a historical logic qualitatively superior to the old dialectic that emanates from the bourgeois revolution, and in which the avant-garde is placed as the center and engine of an uninterrupted process of revolution of the world and of humanity, whose premise is, precisely, its revolutionary baggage and the conscious projection of its own ends, the dialectic, typical of the future second cycle of the RPM, avant-party, historical soil in which, now, it organically roots the proletarian revolution. It is that logic whose subjective food is no longer the reactive spontaneity of the masses, intrinsic to class society, still fertile while the October cycle was not exhausted. Our sinister revolutionary history, in which the class, through its vanguard and as humanity emancipating itself, finds the mortar with which to positively build the kingdom of freedom, the new civilization that emerges from the historical development of the Communist Party. But let's go back to 1923. The vanguard, unable to find itself, will increasingly depend on the state as the center and axis of its policy. Communism crashes in Europe in the mid-20s not only because of the relative stabilization of capitalism, but because of vanguard born, precisely, as an ideological subjective statement that it is the time of the world revolution will not be able to generate its own social objective soil on which to develop the Communist Party rolling, simultaneously, towards the union, inferior form of organization of the proletariat, and the state, superior form of organization of the bourgeoisie, as reference points of communist politics. And in this field, the bourgeoisie demonstrates and has proven to be more than enough stronger than the proletariat. 27. The same subject that emerges in October as a fusion of social being and revolutionary consciousness in an overwhelming torrent lands in Europe, it is true, but lands disintegrated, in the form of a vanguard that raises the horizon of communism but lacking, in general, of its own political traditions and structures, and masses with a long and, for the same reason, consolidated history of militancy and social democratic direction. These poles will never be found. 28. 2. Between the World Revolution and the Popular Front 2.1. The tradition of the dead generations, we are social traitors, social patriots, esquirrels, supporters of the bourgeoisie. Zinoviev has even said that I have committed crimes, and yet, despite those crimes, and despite the fact that we are social patriots, you think it is useful for us to meet in a conference. Vandervelde to the delegates of the Comintern: every historical turn has the paradoxical virtue of exposing the continuities, that which, once the conjunctural and the proper of a certain moment has been swept away, continues to oppressing the souls of the living and from which they cannot escape without tearing it. The Three Congress of the IC, better known as the Congress of the Single Front, held in 1921, while the European workers' revolutions took a downward line, will be the Congress that registers and rationalizes the progressive exhaustion of the spontaneous impulse of masses that illuminates 1917, and from which will emanate the codes that will characterize the Cominternien orthodoxy as a consequent finalization of the paradigm around which October is constituted. The stagnation of the revolutionary offensive forces communism to tactical withdrawal, to consolidate positions, and to cut off the organic connection of Soviet Russia with Europe. But this is not carried out from a comprehensive and projected plan, but, as could not be otherwise given the scarce historical experience of the proletariat as a revolutionary class, from the very march of events and reasoned from the ideological coordinates of the previous period of the labor movement. Indeed, although the class has made the leap to the parias, the experience of it is mediatized by its material structure and interpreted from the ideological prism of social democratic Marxism. Because, as is known, communism has not broken fundamentally with its underlying theoretical premises. In this way, the single front will definitively consecrate the Union as the favorite and natural area of communist action. Although the historiography in use about the Three International tends to write its history based on the turns of its relationship with social democracy, setting two fundamental milestones: the turn to the left of the V Congress and the turn to the right of the Seventh and last Congress, the truth is that the disorientation of the IC begins with the Three Congress, because it is with this that they ossify the dichotomous coordinates that imposed on the Bolsheviks the organicist conception of the party. And the consideration of the unions, hegemonized by opportunists who, supposedly, must be diseased, as the main mass quarry of communism, will be the factors that explain all the subsequent turns in the relationship with social democracy. In Lenin's writings, despite his bitter criticism of opportunism and the workers' aristocracy that sustains it, there are still paragraphs that also point to the idea that unions are neutral organisms, whose only problem is a corrupt leadership. 30. It is a resonance of the period of constitution of the class as a class in itself, economic, at a time when the proletariat faces the new problems posed by the time of the RPM. Its tendency is to return to the known, union and spontaneous practice. This is the place in the history of our class where, for better and for worse, the single front and its long shadow are located. Naturally, that at this moment unity begins to be emphasized for the first time in 7 years is just another consequence of those old ghosts that, not having been exorcised, reappear now. In fact, an attempt is made to present the communists, despite their effective practice since 1914, as the most fervent supporters of the unity of the labor movement. Currently it is the social democratic and centrist parties and tendencies that represent the division and fragmentation of the proletariat, while the communist parties represent an element of union. For the reasons already examined, no other political practice is developed than the one that revolves around the state and the great class struggle, nor is the vanguard itself conceived de facto separated from the masses, as a sphere of substantive activity per se, and with specific tasks to be carried out within it, tasks of which the best representatives of the Three International, with Lenin at the head, were very aware and about whose neglect they never stopped showing their concern. It is the material structure of the subject that emerges in 1917 that determines both its limits and the projection that its vanguard is capable of giving to the crisis, unleashed by the revolutionary reflux of the early 20s, which, let's not forget, called into question the old scheme, with great historical roots, of the revolution as a phenomenon that develops on a directly international level. The approach to social democracy to receive the warm embrace of the spontaneous movement, within the framework of the tactics of the Third Congress and culminating in the fundamental split of the old socialist parties, will be the only mechanism that communism can articulate to address the strategic task of conquering the leaders of the mass movement. In other words, what is in the spotlight is the conquest of the practical avant-garde of the class, which is undertaken in line with the urgency to ride that buoyant mass movement developed outside of communism and with the only tools that it knows and has at reach, those of the old-type labor movement, fundamentally nucleated around the Union as a mass platform and the state as its port of arrival, with the vanguard as an external link between the two and with the unity of the labor movement as a premise. As we say, this is consistent with the articulation of the cycle and, even more, it is a symptom of the creativity of the avant-garde to face new tasks in an original way from the margin that the old methods still leave. But, precisely because of this bastardy and exteriority, said organizational chart is not conformed as a unitary solution, but as a compound in two phases that, like water and oil, remain separate. If it is at this moment when the Comintern codifies an entire vanguard political and revolutionary culture, in which entire generations of communists will be educated and is still enforced today among the majority remains of revisionism, it is also the years in which the revolutionary proletariat is impregnated, in parallel, with the prejudices that the spontaneous movement of the class continuously generates as its self-awareness, a fact that had to be accentuated during the period of reflux. The Three Congress of the IC itself brazenly rationalizes this landing in a starkly consistent way. The communist parties must raise claims whose realization constitutes an immediate and urgent need for the working class and must defend those demands in the mass struggle, without worrying about whether or not they are compatible with the user exploitation of the capitalist class. In passages like this it is contained, in germ and as we can see when analyzing the premises that nucleate the tactics of the Popular Front, the future crisis of the Comintern. Indeed, if we establish a straight line between resistance and revolution, if between the reformist consciousness and the revolutionary consciousness of the proletariat means no more than a difference in degree, there is no reason to question the meaning of the different demands of the masses, much less to position oneself on them. This is not to mention that, with the underestimation of the importance of the global and conscious analysis of the class struggle, its past history and its present direction, the model of the revolutionary cadre as a popular tribune, as a professional revolutionary and strategist of the revolution, becomes completely superficial and unnecessary, with all the serious implications that this has to articulate a solid revolutionary movement capable of sustaining itself and projecting itself forward in time. Its place will be occupied by the bureaucracy, which is nothing more than the symptom of deeper problems. The lack of political independence of communism in the West would become irremediable from the moment its ideological independence is renounced. Naturally, this darkening of the conscious and political subjective factor was accompanied by the resurgence of the theory of collapse, from which Bolshevism had never been emancipated as a general scheme of the revolution, as well as the spontaneous practice that accompanies it. In the current situation of the labor movement, any serious action, even if it has its starting point in partial demands, will fatally lead the masses to raise the fundamental problems of the revolution. Precisely, the red years of 1917 to 1923 showed that the masses posed the fundamental problems of the revolution only with the direct and armed opposition of both class dictatorships. And now it is said, in a period of increasing reaction, that the defense of the partial demands of the masses would be enough to unleash, fatally, the revolution. And this is said, in addition, in the critical moments when the task of splitting the workers' vanguard was, fundamentally, concluded, and the International puts in the foreground the task of its social landing, of the erection of a mass communist movement. As we say, because of the little experience of the proletariat in the management of the new type logics typical of a new period of the development of the working class, the era of imperialism and the RPM, characterized by the split of socialism into two wings, the leaders of the Comintern and the new communist parties will try to solve this problem by going to the unions as the only battlefield, and to the economic struggle of the class as the only field of political activity, without being able to generate a revolutionary, social, new movement, apart from and against the already existing union and political structures generated and dominated by opportunism and reformism. We insist, what is behind all this is the key issue of the practical vanguard of the proletariat, where the constitution of genuine communist parties is at stake, as could be proposed in the initial onslaught of the cycle. The proximity of the communist vanguard to the spontaneous mass movement, both for its historical origin and for the undeniable momentum that the deeds of the first impressed on the second, favored not only the consideration difficult to questions of the unions as a mass quarry for communism, it also made these the explosive terrain in which the immediate future of the imperialist states was played, to which all parties had a special sensitivity, a typical feature of the political culture of the time. 35. Forcibly, the erection of a communist mass movement had to be understood more as the colonization of the reformist movement of the proletariat, occupied by its superior and well-to-do strata, and impregnated with decades of bourgeois respectability and state responsibility, than as the problem of the deep and disorganized masses of the class. 36. In this framework, the relations of the CI must be located with the rest of the working currents in general and with social democracy in particular. So to speak, and this is an eloquent currents lesson for the current tasks of reconstitution of communism, the Three International does not define a mass line to revolutionize the vanguard of the proletariat and, therefore, this task will be solved from the voluntarist calls to unity. This is, not as an objective process, but intersubjective, also reasoned from the spontaneous logic according to which the masses want unity and will condemn the reformists if they do not collaborate with the communists. 37. This circumstance will give rise to the chronic dependence of the communist parties of Western Europe on the social democratic parties, in whose structures the organized and politically active masses were framed and whose movement was forced to lead, without questioning itself about its class content and in what direction it was moving, has the important mission of increasing its influence on the great masses, of strengthening proletarian mass organizations, of conquering trade unions, of neutralizing the influence of the SPD and trade union bureaucracy, and of becoming, in the future struggles of the proletariat, the heads of the mass movements. The parties of the Communist International will become revolutionary mass parties if they know how to overcome opportunism by deducting their objectives from the practical struggles of the proletariat. Logically, the communists' calls for unity did not move the opportunist and reformist leaders in the least, and only led to fiascos such as the Berlin Conference of April 1922. In it, leaders of the Three Internationals, the Second, Third, and the Centrist International of Amsterdam, jokingly known as International 2.5, met for the first time since 1914. But more than in the scene of an idyllic common deliberation, it becomes an accusation against the delegates of the Comintern, unable, on the other hand, to impose their conditions on the opportunistic leaders of the other two internationals. Obviously, the adventure was left in water of borage. 40. The reaction of the communists will be the denunciation of the Social Democrats as saboteurs of unity. Although all this already points, and negative, towards the indispensable political independence of the revolutionary movement prior to any tactical alliance with the rest of the workers' parties, reason why both open enemies and naive friends loan, and praise this period as a sign of relative wisdom in the face of the alleged sectarian derive of later one of the Comintern the vanguard, and the immediate, will only be able to understand the reluctance of social democracy in its direct political aspect, as a stumbling block on the path by which communism is necessarily built in the cycle, and not so much as a manifestation of the historical entrenchment of reformism in the imperialist state, with the dense consequences that this has for the further development of the class struggle. This is, in fact, the substance of the notion of social fascism, which the Comintern coins by certifying the unsuccessfulness of the negotiations with social democracy. Beyond the immediate political applications of the term, the main level in which the communists traditionally handled it, what is behind it is the historical failure of the reform of imperialism as a prelude to the emergence of a reactionary fascist mass movement, and the role that social democracy has played and plays in the generation of the political corporative mechanisms of the imperialist state and that characterize, in its extreme and developed version, fascism. Given the way of building communism that the cycle found, with the union and the unity of the mass movement as axes of its social landing, the term social fascism was rather a direct weapon of war against social democracy and an instrument in the struggle to colonize that movement or, more precisely, to conquer its practical leaders. The fact that the first actions of fascism in power, if not before, went through the repression and disbeheading of the unions for their better corporate integration is already indicative of that special importance that the spontaneous economic movement of the proletariat had for all classes. Think, if not, of the Nazi Reichsarbeitsdienst, literally constituted as an amalgam of trade union organizations of the Weimar era, and the Italian Carta del Lavoro, or in its Francoist parody, archaizing to the Spanish one, the Fuero del Trabajo. The explosiveness of the trade union movement, in the context of the open cycle and with communism as an international revolutionary reference, impelled the bourgeoisie to suppress that destabilizing no man's land that was its practical vanguard, despite everything it could have of reactionary and guild narrow when the social democratic project begins to make water. To the extent that the union was the main piece of the revolutionary organizational chart of communism that unfolds with October, the term social fascism could not immediately be more than a tool in the political struggle for that territory, although, contradictingly with this and precisely in its broad historical sense, social fascism also registers the role of reformism and the workers' aristocracy as structural pillars of imperialism and reaction and, to that extent, the loss, by the union, of its category as a special or main place from which the practical leaders of the revolutionary communist movement of masses. It is in this contradictory crossing that we must locate and understand the struggle that, throughout the 20s and 30s, communism can engage in with fascism. And, in fact, when the failure of the last European revolutions in 1923 exacerbates the Comintern's distrust of the Social Democrats and the V Congress, 1924, establishes the fight against them as the main task, epithetting them the epithet of social fascists, the communists will not be giving any voluntazo, but developing their own historical premises under a new situation of the class struggle. In effect, the single front for the base, traditionally stigmatized by left critics as an example of the alleged sectarian, Zinovivist, or even Stalinist subversion of the Leninian single front, does nothing but take to the end the opposition between the masses framed in the social democratic unions and their opportunistic leaders, a contrast that, as we saw, was already intrinsic in the entire activity of the Three International as a consequent and revolutionary development of the material structure of the subject and the forms it necessarily assumed in its historical emergence, that strategic character of the union, the external relationship between the avant-garde and the masses, the conquest of power as the immediate end and central moment of the revolution, etc. The declared hostility and intransigence of communism towards social reformism, its open countercurrent attitude, ran aground due to the exhaustion of the historical premises listed above, insufficient to reach the practical vanguard of the class, and not due to the excess of communist zeal. As historical experience shows, the lamentations about the Bolshevik intransigence are of little value when the vanguard manages to build its revolutionary mass movement, which is the truly decisive issue and that the proletariat did not manage to solve in the Europe between the wars. It is no longer a question that every ongoing revolution naturally involves excesses. It is that all communist intransigence will be little when the bourgeois odiates the red flag waving in the horizon. The reader is sure that, then, reformism will be just as dogmatic, sectarian and closed, whether red, purple or eco-friendly, when it comes to defending his state and their respective corporate fiefdoms with nails, teeth and frikorps. 2.2, a parenthesis. The Comintern in the Soviet Union. The last key that we are going to examine in our quick overview of the Third International is the relationship of the World Revolution with the Soviet state, and we consciously introduce it at this point because it is at the time of the V Congress when the hierarchy between the two begins to be reversed. With the failure of the last European workers' insurrections of 1923 to 25, a serious debate is triggered within the Bolshevik Party about the possibilities of survival of the Soviet Revolution without the help of the European Revolution. As is known, in this great debate the controversy between Trotsky's permanent revolution and Stalin's socialism in a single country took place. While the first denied, under a leftist radicalization of social democratic economicism, the possibility of sustaining the proletarian dictatorship with the existing means in Russia mainly, the alliance with the peasantry the second still kept alive, within the economicist frameworks of the transition to socialism, the subjective conscious aspect and the socialist direction of the Soviet Union by defending the possibility of transiting from the Russia of the NEP to the future. Industrialized Russia. 44. If Ukrainian establishes a deterministic and fatalistic correlation between dictatorship of the proletariat and forms of property, Stalin still understands politics, dictatorship, as an economic factor capable of transforming existing productive relations, and as the strategic link between the Russia of the mid-20s and industrialization. This does not detract from the fact that, for a long time, in the Bolshevik political subconscious, socialism was identified with state capitalism, and most likely it will have to be considered that the practice effectively carried out in the second half of the 20s was in contradiction with the theorization that, on the fly, the PCBR was doing. 45. But, precisely as long as this path had not been traveled, as long as small property and private capitalism still predominated in the USSR, the ideological premises of Bolshevism could still sustain a proletarian revolutionary practice, the active transformation of the world as a creative subject, even despite its growing wear and tear. This takes us to the depth of the roots of Bolshevism in Russia, where the dictatorship of the proletariat took land relying instrumentally on the two axes that European history illuminated as the keys to bourgeois transformation and, therefore, progress from the point of view of a Russia barely awakened from absolutism the democratic revolution and industrialization. Only in this way is it explained that, while Stalin is still able to see the political character of the NEP and the worker-peasant alliance, he does so at the cost of taking the definitive step towards the identification of socialism with state capitalism and the great industry, labeled as socialist economy. Then, in 1917, it was a matter of moving from the power of the bourgeoisie to the power of the proletariat. Now, in 1925, it is about moving from the current economy, which cannot be called socialist as a whole, to the socialist economy, to the economy that must serve as the material basis of socialist society. The theory of socialism in a single country, as an original response to the situation created in the mid-120s, is fundamentally linked to the milestone of the first stabilization of a proletarian state in history during a period of revolutionary reflux. If this was possible, it is because the Bolshevik Party had conquered, fundamentally, the logic and management of the dictatorship of the proletariat, which is nothing other than socialism, and that the transition between capitalism that dies and communism that is born. Now, this conquest is also charged for its retribution. Between one and the other stage of the development of humanity is that transition to socialism with which Bolshevism had resolved the contradiction between its practice and the Kautsky evolutionist background of its conception of the transition society, and socialism is identified not with the dictatorship of the proletariat, but with a substantive mode of production. This formula allows, in turn, to treat the world revolution and the construction of socialism in the USSR as independent problems. The task is, on the one hand, to unite the proletariat and the poor peasants with the average peasants on the basis of a solid alliance between them, to ensure the direction of the proletariat within that alliance, to intensify the development and re-equipment of our industry, to incorporate the masses of millions of peasants into cooperation and thus guarantee the victory of the socialist core of our economy over the elements of capitalism, and, on the other hand, to organize the alliance, both with the proletarians of all countries and with the colonial peoples of the oppressed countries, to help the revolutionary proletariat in its struggle for victory over capitalism. This dualization responds to the exhaustion of that perspective of developing the RPM on a directly international level and to the organic disconnection between socialism in the USSR and the European Revolution, determined not only by geopolitical issues but, fundamentally, by the intertwining of revolutions that the emergence of the cycle and the subsequent importance of the difference between being east or west of the Urals. In Europe, due to its advance, in bourgeois terms, with respect to Russia, industrialization could not offer a margin of revolutionary transformation of society, of subjective activity to promote it, but was already part of the accumulated historical object and of consolidated and sedimented capitalist normality. Precisely, one of the traits that characterizes the October cycle as an unrepeatable historical framework is the instrumental use of the mechanisms of the bourgeois revolution, which serve as a first platform for the entry of the universal subject into history. But this only made sense where they had not yet taken off, as in Russia. This means, so to speak, that the European vanguard was not able to connect with the previous history, much less to consciously project it towards the future, towards the dictatorship of the proletariat. With this dualization, and especially with the identity between socialism and consolidated industrialization, the foundations are laid to definitively reverse the relationship between the Soviet state and the world communist movement, vertebrated by the IC. Since socialism is not essentially the dictatorship of the proletariat, but a proper and substantive mode of production that must be built and defended, the USSR ceased to be a support base for the RPM and became the base of the RPM, to the extent that it housed inside that socialist core of the economy from which it would spread over the globe. Or it would be confined to the limits of the USSR. This rationalization was necessary to the extent that the stabilization of the Soviet camp occurred over the prospect of the country's industrialization. And it is that, as the history of the entire bourgeois revolution teaches, the emergence of the national industry is intimately linked to the emergence of the modern state, as a space in which that new economic content can be stabilized and conjure, better or worse, the class antagonisms that accompany it in its emergency. It is this same logic that is reproduced here, and it is no coincidence that it is associated both with the progressive Great Russian nationalist degeneration of socialism in a single country and with the ossification and territorialization of the October Revolution, already definitively enclosed in the borders of the USSR. Indeed, after the failures of the European insurrections of 1921-25 and the Chinese disaster of 1927, and already established this ideological framework, the impulse to the RPM will no longer be considered an indispensable condition for the survival of the Soviet Union and the dictatorship of the proletariat. 48. The communist proletariat of Western countries, or, more precisely, its vanguard, had proved incapable of decisively influencing the great class struggle, let alone help the USSR directly. So the axis of the Soviet survival strategy would gravitate more and more towards the alliance with the capitalist states as the main task, leaving the RPM as a means of pressure with which to threaten them. Although Stalin, at least until 1927, still has in mind the role of the revolution in the colonies and in Western Europe, it is no secret that, at this time, the People's Curset for Foreign Relations, Narkomendel, and Foreign Relations occupied most of the attention of the Soviet leaders, greater, of course, than the ill-fated IC. We must approach the countries defeated in the imperialist war, the capitalist countries that have been more humiliated and stripped in the distribution and that, by virtue of this, form the opposition to the dominant alliance of the great powers, even to the hard line of strong leftist traditions and more friend of mountacious adventures than of political calculation, Bela Kun, Norin, Lozovsky. It was difficult to escape this scheme, a symptomatic circumstance of the underlying paradigm that shared all the sensitivities of the labor movement, educated or not within the Comintern. 51, as we say, due to the conception of the transitional society as a mode of production itself and the depth of the mass impulse opened by October, it was difficult to escape the temptation to use the Soviet state as an organizer of the social forces unleashed by accelerated industrialization and, to that extent, to understand it as a reference point of the entire proletarian revolution, which, on the other hand, logical to a certain extent, since we are talking about the Laos to Paris. Commune this license first state of the dictatorship of the proletariat. And all the more so as that state industry was consolidated that, in Soviet schemes, was identified with the socialist mode of production. It is in fact in those key years of 1925 to 26 when, within the Soviet state, sectors in charge of the management of the economy appear that already openly demand labor readjustments, intensification of the working day, and reduction of wages for the sake of the greater efficiency and speed of industrialization. 52. These are, obviously, the technical and managerial cadres that are being constituted as a new bourgeoisie and in whose economic foundation the state is inscribed as the main apparatus violent and coercive of extracting capital gain. This intimate connection between industrialization and the state would be insurmountable for the Bolsheviks, since it constitutes the core of their own conception of socialism. 53. Even more, by 1928 the Pan-Russian Central Executive Committee, VTSIK, tries, by decree, to revive urban and peasant Soviets as a base of support for imminent industrialization. Its failure testifies that the spontaneous impulse of the masses had already been sublimated in the impulse of the masses by the state towards collectivization and accelerated industrialization. Such is the secret of the long decadence of the IC and its subordination to Soviet foreign policy. Refuted, by the practical experience of those years, the idea of a proletarian revolution that develops on a directly international plane, there was no other element, apart from the Soviet state, capable of urgently reorganizing the activity of the masses towards the construction of socialism and, eventually, against the Nazi-fascist military offensive. Only the Soviet state proved capable of giving continuity to the boisterous mass activity unleashed in 1917, but at the price of exhausting and stabilizing it, and not for anything other than because the state is the only organism that can intervene, directly and without further mediation, in the direction and management of social life. For this very reason, because the content of its activity is the reorganization of the forces already unleashed, its nature can only be conservative, even in the case of the proletarian state. While the Communist Party is the movement that exceeds the existing order of things, the state is the glue that integrates the existing order of things. Between those two poles and their progressive interaction, we must understand the evolution of relations between the USSR and the IC. By 1925, the IC has been definitely unable to build the transmission belts that made mediated intervention possible in the countries of Western Europe, and the Soviet state has already consecrated itself as the mechanism that, immediately, can better and more quickly complete the Bolshevik revolutionary program, collecting the mass momentum that starts with October and projecting it and, at the same time, exhausting it in the direction of industrialization. Such is, at the same time, the key that allowed, in Russia, the revolutionary instrumentalization of the state inherited from Tsarism. 2.3. The hot decade of the ultra-left? In summary, within the Soviet Revolution it had still been possible to keep that political link alive, subjective conscious, even despite its growing carting, on the outside, in the imperialist West. Communism was completely disoriented and unable to take a fixed direction. The turn to the left of the V Congress had not been a conscious and planned response to the new situation either, but a reaction and, therefore, conditioned by the outside world. Subject to factors external to the revolutionary proletariat itself, to the failure of the workers' insurrections, to the lack of enthusiasm of social democracy for the United Front, and to the already threatening shadow of fascism. 56. The reworking of the tactic of the single front, in the V Congress, as a single front for the base means, as we have already indicated, the culmination of all previous trends. First of all, the analyses of the Comintern abruptly separate the masses framed in the social democracy from the socialist leaders, as if they were kidnapped by them, and it was enough to remove the dome to free the dull conscience of the masses. At the same time, communism continues to give way to the resistance organisms of the working class. In 1929, the Revolutionary Trade Union Opposition, RGO, will be constituted in Germany as part of the objectives and methods outlined by the V and Six Congresses, which aims to create an alternative counter-union to break the social democratic hegemony, and that will serve as a model for this entire period. 57. The turn to the left ends up consecrating the retreat of the communists towards the organs of spontaneous resistance of the masses as the main battlefield in Western countries. On the other hand, the V Congress makes official the Bolshevization of the European Communist parties. The reasoning that supports it, since 1923, is that if the communist parties in the West have not been able to take power, this is because, supposedly, they have not been able to consistently apply the guidelines emanating from the International. 58. This occurs in that context of progressive degradation of the figure of the vanguard militant and, consequently, will decisively burden the ability of the International to recover the bellows by unloading all responsibility for the failures to the national leaderships, which err in the way of executing the tactical slogans. What the IC is really doing is closing the door to the self-critical examination of its slogans and conceptions in the light of its own practice, given that between this and those stands the mantra of deficient execution, which blocks the dialectic development of both. This executive logic will have very serious consequences not only in Bolshevik practice, but, fundamentally, in the body of ideas that sustains it and its conception of socialism and communism. 59. This question is important to properly calibrate the left criticisms that authors such as Claudin or Struch pour on the IC, arguing that its insensitivity to national peculiarities, its centralized character, and, finally, Bolshevization turned this organization into little more than a puppet in the hands of Stalin, which he was able to make and undo at will until he had it completely dominated, because precisely under these criticisms some of the elements of principle that characterize the IC as the World Party of the Revolution are called into question. And it was not centralism, nor a supposed blindness to national peculiarities, which ended up transforming the CI into an appendix of the Soviet state, but the practices, traditions and conceptions that made the Communist Party the simple annex of the spontaneous mass movement and the Union, with all its spontaneous, practicalist and executive implications, and that Bolshevization came to reinforce. In other words, it was not an excess of avant-garde that weakened and sclerotized the Comintern. On the contrary, it was the collapse of the avant-garde perspective and its tools, the revolutionary principles, the ideological struggle, the balance of its own practice that opened the gap through which the incipient bureaucracy could thrive. What's more, a scholar of the Bolshevik Revolution like E.H. Carr, far from the controversies in which the peers of the PCE raised their criticisms and with a substantially wider documentary battery in his hand, denies that dichotomous vision according to which the Stalinist bureaucracy would have subjected the leadership of the communist parties to its will and suppressed its local peculiarities. 60, rather, and despite the fact that by 1930 the old particular dissensions of each party had been ventilated, closing ranks around the defense of the USSR and the Moscow Authority, they manifested themselves in other forms, fundamentally related to the position to be adopted in the face of fascism and social democracy, with strong local differences and not exempt from serious crises. The French, Austrian, and British communists were important nuclei of support for the subsequent tactics of the Popular Front, while, in Germany, the masses of the KPD represented the opposite tendency, constituting a notable internal opposition. That the parties were not monolithic blocks cut according to a certain Moscow pattern is a fact that Claudin also includes, despite everything, when mentioning Thalmann's difficulties in neutralizing internal discontent in the KPD even after the expulsion of Brandler, Thalheimer, and the remains of the old Spartacist Guard, accused of being supporters of Bujarin. 61. This, on the other hand, speaks to us but of the serious bewilderment that reigned in the field of communism, unable to find a defined and stable tactic capable of deploying an organized international offensive, and of the futility of bureaucratic methods to solve and overcome the particular dilemmas of each national section of the IC, which do nothing but take new forms. Indeed, the tendency to dispatch internal dissensions based on bureaucratic procedures, which now become tradition, did not reorganize communism, but annulled the resources of the avant-garde, such as the two-line struggle, to fulfill this task. The spontaneous and catastrophic ingredient was paired with an unrealistic political analysis, and that, rather than being a product of the aptitude or ineptitude of the leaders of the Comintern, constitutes an eloquent materialistic teaching about the close relationship they have, in proletarian revolutionary practice, the material physiognomy of the subject, its radius of action immediate, and the formal analysis of the conjuncture, synthesized in the Marxist formula of no transforming. And it is that, without the tools that would allow their active and autonomous action on a social scale in European countries, communists would overestimate the revolutionary perspectives in them, an illusion that was reinforced by the theory of collapse and its spontaneous prejudices. In 1926, General Pilsudski ascends to power in Poland. In Italy, all political and trade union organizations are banned except the National Fascist Party, and the British Labour movement suffers a resounding defeat in what was one of its largest and most important general strikes. And yet, that same year, the Sixth Congress of the IC proclaims that a third period of revolutionary ascension had arrived. The balance of the 1920s is notoriously dramatic, and this assessment of the Comintern is called into question. Between 1921 and 1928, the number of communist militants in capitalist countries falls by half, while that of social democratic workers is doubled. 62. At the Fifth Congress of the Red Trade Union International, Profintern, held in August 1930, Lozovsky was forced to recognize that the Red Unions, called to be the strategic basis of the new proletarian offensive according to the economicist schemes of the IC, were in sharp decline, France, Czechoslovakia, when they were not directly illegalized and had lost their mass base. 63. And it is that the line of the IC for Western countries was not only incapable of constituting the revolutionary party of the proletariat, nor could it stabilize the red syndicates, even as mere resistance organisms. The ineffectiveness of this policy comes to show that the plane from which the vanguard affects the self-transformation of the class towards communism is the Communist Party, superior form of organization of the proletariat, and that any line that defends or insinuates the sectioned and particularized treatment of each of its resistance organizations, such as the Union, but not only, also company cells, women's associations, neighborhood collectives, is condemned to constrict its perspective to the inferior forms of the class struggle of the proletariat and, also, to be incapable even to reproduce the mere existence of these. Hence, red class and combative unionism, and today more than in 1930, only has in general the option of dissolving in the openly reformist union or being reduced to marginality. The weakness of communism became more disturbing with the brown beast on the horizon. We have already outlined, when referring to the concept of social fascism, the underlying logic that articulated the struggle that the IC could hold against fascism, based on the theoretical and political tools that it historically had. It is not that the CI did not take fascism seriously, it is that the conception that could be forged of it was mediated by the historical lesson about the tremendous and novel role of social democracy as a social stock of capital and, consequently, of its centrality in the political mechanisms of stabilization of imperialism. With the formation of von Papen's government in 1932, the IC explicitly points out this connection. Points out that the center of gravity of the German political situation was happening from social democracy as the main social mainstay of the bourgeoisie to the combat organization of the bourgeoisie itself, the terrorist gangs of Hitler's mass party. And if we say, with the Comintern, that fascism is, on the other hand, the combat organization of the bourgeoisie, and we take this in its strict military sense, The simple materialistic teaching that war is the continuation of politics by other means should naturally lead us to put the focus of the problem not on fascism itself, but on the social reformism that feeds it and whose failure provides it with its political springboard. Hence, again, the logic of the fight against social fascism as the main task, which is not the product of either blindness or communist sectarianism, but of the granted consequence with its own revolutionary premises, as they were specifically given at the time. It is this that gives the vanguard all its greatness and dignity, the fact that, even despite the growing wear and tear of these premises, it has taken them to the end, burning them and offering future generations of revolutionaries a superior starting perspective. This consequence of communism with itself is the reason why there may continue to be proletarian revolutionaries tomorrow and, more importantly, the day after tomorrow, although in the immediate future tragic is the story when it acts as a midwife of the future, those same premises could not be equipped with a greater path and projection. In that same year of 1932, the IC dismisses the possibility of triumph of Nazism to the extent that Germany was different from semi-agricultural Poland and Italy. It was the country with the largest mass communist party, the country that is closest to all important countries, to the proletarian revolution. These types of diagnoses, unfortunately unfortunate and marked by the catastrophic imprint of the theory of collapse, but for the same reason fully intrinsic in the paradigm of the cycle, go back, significantly, to the V Congress of the Comintern, when, with his turn to the left, they became a common currency. Already in 1924 we find valuations such as that, in Italy, fascism, after its victory, is shipwrecked in the political bankruptcy that leads to its internal decomposition, while in Germany it falls into a similar crisis without having obtained its formal victory. However, justice must be done to the Comintern regarding the illusions it could hold about Germany in 1924, because the Munich Putsch had been unsuccessful the previous year, and the good German-Soviet relations as part of that strategy of approaching the humiliated countries in Versailles, whose exemplary exponent is the Treaty of Rapallo of 1922, gave some calm to the communist leaders, who also trusted that the failure of the Dawes Plan and the Locarno Treaty would bring Germany closer, if not to a proletarian revolution, yes to the Soviet Union definitively. 67, even more, this strategy could be reconciled, better or worse, with the recent turn to the left, because those who insisted most on giving the Weimar Republic a pro-Western orientation in its foreign relations were precisely the Social Democrats. The supporters of an approach to Russia were, paradoxically, the parties of the German right, which shared with the Soviet Union the anger against Versailles. 69. Germany. Both for this volatile and strategic situation on the international stage and for the violent animosity between the two wings of the labor movement without disregarding factors such as its dense interrelationship with the American economy, the product of 10 years of DDoSization and aid at the time of the crisis of 29. It will be the country that concentrates like no other the conditions to constitute a weak link of the imperialist chain, with the eloquent precedent of the Spartan uprising and the numerous insurrectional explosions that happened to it for 5 years. However, the long years of disorientation and material weakness of communism will take their toll, and the conceptions of the IC will be unable to give way to the revolutionary crisis, when it is exacerbated in the 1930s. In January 1931, Thälmann had already advocated the popular revolution as the main strategic slogan of the party and assimilated it to the proletarian revolution. Logically, this is due to the supposed need to present the German Revolution in national terms, and not so much of a class. The leadership of the KPD had even gone so far as to suggest that the German proletarian revolution should be fixed as a programmatic point, the unification of all the territories of the German population. As it is collected from everything that has been said, this was not only to eat ground from some Nazis who had been able to skillfully exploit resentment against the Treaty of Versailles, as in a somewhat simplistic way has traditionally been seen. The formulation of the German Revolution in national terms obeys deeper causes, which have to do, as we have insisted, with the inability of the subject to provide himself with a wide social material projection in Europe, and with the subsequent lack of his own political soil, proletarian revolutionary, of action. At the moment when the IC and its premises begin to be exhausted and to manifest a growing practical impotence, only a new Congress will be convened, the last, in the face of the emergency situation of 1935, that is, 7 years after the previous one. At the moment, at the beginning of the 30s, Soviet foreign policy and the tactics of the communists in Germany, unlike in 1924, enter into contradiction. The right-wing Brüning had been, since November 1930, governing by means of urgent presidential decrees and liquidating, de facto, the bourgeois democracy of Weimar, already extremely weakened. 72. The SPD supported him. It was time to point out how the social fascists became, by forced marches, open fascists. However, the Brüning cabinet was striving to improve relations with the USSR at the time when accelerated industrialization and collectivization began, and the KPD will find itself paralyzed between the defense of Soviet interests and the national popular framework that it gave to the future German Revolution, the only way in which it was now able to raise it. And it is that, having not been able to conquer the practical vanguard of the class, the only anti-fascist struggle that the national sections of the IC could sustain would necessarily pass through the anti-fascist unity with the social democracy and the liberal faction of the bourgeoisie. As a direct way to organize a mass fortress against fascism, that gap between these and the communists would be filled with the fusion of the avant-garde and the existing state, including the parties that mediate between it and the masses of the nation. Indeed, here there is no more turn than the consequent development of the premises of the subject as they could be concretized in the particular conjuncture of bourgeois Europe. The October cycle revolves around the state as the central problem of the revolution. If in the Soviet Union the existing state was, despite everything, a bourgeois state without a bourgeoisie, Lenin Dixit, a product of the proletarian revolution and in the hands of the Bolshevik vanguard, this guaranteed a certain coherence between the subjective revolutionary end and the state environment through which it takes land among the masses. In Germany, on the other hand, the existing state was the bourgeois state with bourgeoisie, and also in its typical form, parliamentary. Turned off the remnants of the small insurrectional cycle of 1917 to 1923 that gave meaning to the fight against social fascism for a decade, the vanguard will only be able to resort to the mechanisms it knows in the only possible way at that time and place, that is, to merge its forces with the state to give a push to the mass movement. And, as the basic law of the mercantile world teaches, everything has a price. The state, which in Europe is classically bourgeois both in form and content, will force the communists to accept that the only movement that through their mediation they can aspire to lead will be a mass movement with bourgeoisie, or it will not be. The communists, through this journey and as an inevitable spiritual counterpart of their practice, will then arrive, as is known, to bourgeois ideology in its classical formulation, the state, and more specifically bourgeois democracy, as a sublimated entity located above society and classes. This will be progressively more explicit than implicit. After the 12th plenary of the IKKI, 1932, Ramelli presents a memorandum that includes, for the first time, the call to defend parliamentary democracy against fascism through a united front as broad as possible. In turn, and it is still a wake-up call that must be emphasized, Ramelli, also for the first time within the tradition of the IC, postulates the need for Western communism, a fact that in practice denies the universal validity of Bolshevism, that is, of the current under whose umbrella the revolutionary cycle was opened. This has its share of truth, to the extent that the growing limitations of Bolshevism had closed the way to the dictatorship of the proletariat in Europe, but it is no less true that the first and, at this time, the only proletarian dictatorship in the world was the direct work of the Bolsheviks, so his role as an international revolutionary reference continued to grant, and with it to the IC, the depositary dignity of the vanguard element. At this time, the mere affiliation to the Cominternian tradition meant directly and immediately supplied with October and with the communist project of integral and international transformation of the world. 74. The first explicit defense of parliamentary democracy and, therefore, of a state that was not the Soviet one was accompanied by the demand not of an international universal communism, but of a local national communism, in which adaptation to the current political state order is constituted in its premise, to the detriment of the internationalist fusion of the class in its world headquarters. 75. The triumph of the populist front line and the submission of the proletariat to the democratic bourgeoisie and petty bourgeoisie were a matter of time. Between 1917 and 1935, the Comintern will have completed its historical decline, from the subjective and rising flowering of the vanguard, and of the Communist Party as its content and corresponding form of deployment, to the Union, and from the Union to the extreme left comparsa of the democratic bourgeoisie. The history is tragic to such an extent that the triumphs of the Soviet proletariat removing Russia to its foundations also removed the foundations on which the revolution in Europe had to be sustained. 2.4. The Seventh Congress on January 30th, 1933, Hitler ascended to the Chancellery, and the KPD launched a call for a general strike to face it. The failure is absolute. The social democracy disregards the matter, naively arguing that its struggle is carried out by legal means and in the terms of the Constitution. 76. For everyone, including the IC, it is evident that communism does not constitute a politically independent force in Germany. The repression is unleashed, and in it the SPD will not have better luck than the KPD. The position of the Comintern before the carnage is enough to understand to what extent the RPM and the Soviet state had been dissociated in their schemes. Hitler knows how to distinguish between communism and our state. 3 months later, the protocol for the extension of the German-Soviet Pact of 1926, Rapallo's direct heir, would still be ratified. 78. It is not until the beginning of 1934 that the German-Polish Pact was signed, with a clear anti-Bolshevik sense, and only then does the Soviet Union begin to weave a network of alliances with the capitalist states, starting with France and Czechoslovakia, the countries that housed the two largest communist parties in Europe after the sinking of the KPD. The place occupied by the RPM in this system of pacts is, for Stalin, of course. The bourgeoisie can be sure that the many friends of the working class of the USSR in Europe and Asia would try to strike blows in the rear to their oppressors, if they dared to unleash a criminal war against the homeland of the working class of all countries. This is the icing on the cake that culminates and concludes the entire process that we have been examining. The working class and the RPM as pressure factors to force the anti-Hitlerian pact between the USSR and the liberal parliamentary capitalist powers. Again, the 7th and last Congress of the IC does nothing but give a letter of nature to a turn that has already occurred. When it is met, in July 1935, it is 2 months since the signing of the Franco-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. In that period, the PCF had gone from being a fiercely belligerent party with the bourgeoisie and the French army systematically voting against war credits and rearing revolutionary defeatism, to actively supporting the French national defense militarist policy and even offering its support to a radical party government. It is difficult to justify, from the point of view of communism, that the renunciation of the independent construction of the instruments of the revolution, including the army, guaranteed that France would not ally itself with Germany against the Soviet Union, a possibility that was always open until 1939. But Torres, Secretary General of the PCF, soon found the theoretical justification for this turn. If a war against the Soviet Union, he says, is not carried out by all the imperialist states, if any of them, by virtue of the contradictory interests that oppose them to the others, act in concert with the country of socialism, his action objectively serves the cause of peace, is confused with the cause of the power of the workers. The case of the PCF clearly shows how, far from being of practical agreement or of tactical adjustment, The future line of the Popular Front consists of the fusion of the communist proletariat with the imperialist state mediated by the parties of the bourgeois left and a complete review of Leninism. The tactic of accumulating forces in the face of the immediate fascist military offensive is not articulated around the independent institutions of communism. It is not articulated around the communist parties, the International, ideologically orphaned at this point, and the Red Army, non-existent, saving the workers' militias quickly subordinated to the national defense system of the bourgeoisie, but around the system of states of imperialism and the alliances that the conjunct can facilitate. This is, around geopolitics. As for the revision of the principles, it means accepting the nation-state as an unquestionable framework from which to build communism, including all the weight of tradition and the national patriotic paraphernalia that accompanies it in each country. 81. With this in mind, it is at least difficult to believe that what was ventilated in the 7th Congress of the IC was, as Dimitrov proclaimed at the end of his speech, to sweep fascism, and with it capitalism, from the face of the earth. Dimitrov himself expresses, in the resolution on his report, that the content of the Popular Front is the defense of workers in their immediate economic interests and against fascism, and at no point in Congress did any of the delegates try to explain how these tasks were linked to the mission of sweeping capitalism from the face of the earth, or how they led to it, an issue that is postponed to an indefinite future. That is, the political crisis as Lenin demanded in 1914-17 was not linked to the propaganda and preparation of the revolution. Just as the inextricable vicissitudes of geopolitics confuse imperialism with the cause of socialism, the economic resistance of workers is mysteriously heading towards the fall of capitalism. And it is that the other star theme of the 7th Congress, perhaps less known and studied, was the issue of union unification, which is understood as the premise of the reunification of the labor movement for its due transformation into a functional bastion of defense against fascism. 84. This is the bottom of the line endorsed by the IC, the working class reduced to its economic status of the exploited class and placed as the extreme left of the liberal bourgeoisie. In other words, it supposes the resurrection of the old Menshevik slogan of the extreme opposition party, which had been formulated, in addition, at a time when the international split of socialism had not yet been operated on two wings and whose effects on the labor movement, judging by the content of the tactic that the IC now assumes, are unsuccessfully attempted to reverse. 85. It was, indeed, too late. And it was also too late to oppose a coherent policy to fascism because the particular material configuration with which communism lands in Western Europe that always present division between the communist vanguard and the working masses, overwhelmingly social democratic added to the ideological paradigm that already from an early date hindered the subversion of this structure, conditioned that the proletariat could not find here the way to develop its independent revolutionary policy, as part of an international revolutionary policy, and independent policy does not mean independent of the IC, but independent of the logics and structures of the bourgeoisie, in its liberal version as a corporate, and for which an adequate general line in the CI is indispensable. Hence, all the debates and all the turns that occurred during the 20s and 30s revolved, fundamentally, around the problem of the relationship with social democracy and were clearly conditioned by it. And that the recommendations made in 1930 by a furious anti-Stalinist like Trotsky had the same background and logic that the decisions adopted by the IC in its 7th and last Congress, reflects only the common fund to all the currents that emerged as a result of October. The single front policy of the workers against fascism is deduced from the whole situation. It opens up immense possibilities to the Communist Party. We must conclude agreements against fascism with various social democratic organizations and factions in the fight against fascism. We must be willing to conclude practical agreements of struggle with the devil, with his mother-in-law, and even with Noski and Zorjabal. Hitler is now the common enemy. After having won it, we will do the balance together with you, and we will see how to continue the path. And it is that social democracy, in the context of the still open cycle, represented nothing other than that economic class, with awareness in itself, and an ascension trajectory, and that, in the face of the dilemma of the RPM, chooses the reform. He has, behind him, all the historical and material weight of the previous period of maturation of the class-carrying progress, and this is an assistant that young communism could not count on then. And, if there is something that in the bourgeois world collects and synthesizes all this weight of the past, the domination of the dead over the living, that is the state. The state, apart from its most immediate dimension of organized violence, is the being there of the immense ideological, political, and military power that the bourgeoisie has in its world, as well as its inertias and its logics. When communism consumes, badly than well, its policy of rapprochement and, ultimately, fusion with social democracy, it also consumes its fusion with the existing state, territorially separated from other states and whose services, like a pact with the devil, require spiritual submission to all the ghosts that court it, such as the nation or the parliament. At the moment when international vicissitudes forced the emergency situation, the Nazi-fascist offensive, and the last barrier that still separated communism from historical social democracy is broken, the Popular Front was the outcome, perhaps not necessary, but logical. And if the urgent generally threatens what is necessary, the state, whose function can be summarized both historical and political as an organization of what is given, has demonstrated, and demonstrates, a demon-based potential to become the advocate of the urgent and facilitate its also urgent integration into the global system of imperialism, even if it is Comintern itself. Or the imperialist system of states, or the Communist International, in the same way as the immortals, only one can remain. If the state organizes the urgent, the Communist Party becomes what is necessary. 3. Epilogue and Prologue, the historic place of the Comintern 3.1. The Spanish Civil War, penultimate episode of the Communist International. The Popular Front tactics would not reach Germany on time. In France, despite everything, it would not finish curdling. Only in the Spanish Civil War was it put into practice, thanks to the revolutionary situation created from 1931 and, especially, 1934. The Asturian Revolution and the proclamation of the Catalan state, with the subsequent political crisis that they unleash, coincide with the change of orientation in the Comintern, and the PCE hastily enters the workers' alliances promoted by the PSOE. The fierce repression that is unleashed on the insurgents of the Eight, as well as the demagogy that the right makes around it, is enough to unleash a wide popular indignation. And the left-wing Republicans and the PSOE see the opportunity to make their August, the Popular Front, and the Second Spanish Republic, was born as an electoral coalition aimed at channeling the spontaneous movement towards a government that applied the amnesty. Of all the signatory parties, only the PCE bet unsuccessfully on transforming the electoral coalition into a government coalition. That is, on formalizing the government for the masses. And it is that, if there was a Popular Front in the Spanish Republic, this was due to the situation opened by the Asturian and Catalan episodes and the consequent realignment of the class forces, facilitated by a PSOE with a wide tradition of coalitions and alliances with republicanism. The PCE, on the other hand, was still a party especially dependent on Soviet foreign policy. It had been born as a result of the debate on the international 1919 to 1921 and not in 1917, and had done so as two parties, the Spanish Communist Party 1920 and the PCOE 1921, faced by sectarian struggles that would have to be resolved by the IC and Graziade, its delegate, in 1921. All the defects that burdened all the European communist parties were aggravated in the Spanish case. From the scarce theoretical projection of this party, which would drag the Krausist and humanist aftertaste of the Marxism of the PSOE, to its especially serious dependence on social democracy. This conditioned that the PCE was a relatively marginal force in the Spanish social formation until the final years of the Republic, and incapable, until then, of influencing as a determining force in the class struggle. And if only with the Civil War could this situation be turned around, this is due to the fact that the same timid character that tricolor reformism had shown from the beginning, since the biennium 1931-33, now faces a situation of enormous crisis of the Republican system, which the parties of the Popular Front approach with a staggering lightness. Bourgeois politicians knew that a military conspiracy was being prepared for months before, but, likewise, they were perfectly aware that, given the situation, the only way to deal with it was the general armament of the people. The Republicans delayed this decision until the last moment, whose tragicomic final episode is the pathetic humor of Casares Quiroga at the news that the army had risen in Morocco. Well, get up. I'm going to go to bed. The masses, accustomed to the incompetence of the authorities and to take on their own the defense against the army already from the Sanjajata, step out and prevent the immediate success of the coup. But the task of organizing that spontaneity to face the protracted military conflict that was coming is seriously posed. With the collapse of the Republican state and the failure of its synonymous parties to organize and direct the Civil War, the PCE will assume the role of the extreme left of bourgeois democracy that was assumed in the line of the Popular Front. This is the secret of its explosive growth in this period, as the only party that, at first, could face the tasks of the war in a radical way, not only reconstructing the political and military structures of the bourgeoisie, but also aborting the occupation of farms and factories to which the masses had spontaneously thrown themselves and standing as a champion of petty bourgeois property. Thus, the slogan of first win the war and then make the revolution frontally rejects the stabilization of that mass power as the main weapon against the fascist counter-revolution, militarily superior, and will stagnate the Republican zone in a war of defensive positions, in which the territory and the strong squares play the main role. The reactionary army has a free way to apply its strategy of slowing down and attrition and undermine, little by little but sustainably, the resources and morale of the tricolor side. That is, the line of the Popular Front is incapable of giving a path to a mass power that was already developing and that could have been configured as a new power. From the first day, the PCE will bet on integrating the spontaneous forms of organization of the masses as part of the sunken Republican state, mending it and burning the ships that would have allowed it to build the dictatorship of the proletariat through the revolutionary destruction of what was left of the Spanish state, and that, in this context, it could have been possible to do so according to that scheme of the IC that advocated listing the spontaneous movement of the masses. Although insufficient from the point of view of what was already achieved then by the revolutionary movement, the situation of civil confrontation, of open war in the form of masses against masses, added to the fact that the proletariat and the peasantry were, de facto, applying their violent dictatorship against the gentlemen and the Republican state lay in ashes, made this strategy of construction of the new power would have had more travel than it had in Europe. But, at the time when this scheme could be applied, the Comintern and the PCE, their accumulated traditions and contradictions, liquidate this possibility. On the other hand, and as a secondary aspect of the matter, Soviet foreign policy had already fully immersed itself in the tactic of alliances with Franco-British imperialism. Encouraging a proletarian revolution in Spanish lands could think it and promote an anti-Bolshevik entente of Germany and Italy with the liberal parliamentary states. This also favored the naive confidence in the help of the Western powers and in the farce of the Non-Intervention Committee. In this line, the policy followed by the PCE of Ibaruri and Diaz was to merge with the bourgeois state, a crime that only worsens before the prospect that the Spanish proletariat had closer than ever all the ingredients to build the dictatorship of the proletariat. The necessary reverse of letting this historic opportunity pass was, in the first instance, the transformation of a party like the PCE, which had its own army, the V Regiment, into a military party. In other words, the rifle, the needs of war, is in charge of the party, the needs of the revolution. Moreover, the PCE's own strategy, which would annul any mass organization independent of the bourgeois Republican state and would indulge in a static war of positions, burned the tables from which the clandestine counteroffensive could have been resumed after the fascist triumph. The Maquis, despite its undoubted and shocking heroism, is nothing more than the shadow of what could not be, and testimony to the bankruptcy of the PCE line even after its military defeat. Precisely because it all plays to the war's card, the end of it was the solution of the continuity of the revolution in the Spanish state, a parenthesis that still lasts today and the reason why, 80 years later, we are still tormented by the spectral screams of our martyrs. 91, 3.2. Two tactics: the opportunistic line of first win the war and then make the revolution led the PCE not only not being able to make the revolution, but not even winning the war. It is the practical application and refutation of the Popular Front, and as the penultimate table of communism to face fascism, it will naturally lead to the self-dissolution of the Comintern in 1943, agreed with British imperialism as an offering to seal the Allied coalition. The imperialist system of states and its system of alliances had devoured the IC. However, the USSR was still able to win the Great Patriotic War precisely because of that, for having stabilized the revolutionary push of 1917 in an entire state system that retained the momentum of the masses, and for directing it against Hitler's aggression. But, at the same time that this enterprise carries out, the premises on which it was based are exhausted, closed the era of the great chapters of socialist offensive against internal and external enemies, communism of war, collectivization, Nazi-fascist aggression, and conquered the peace concerted with England at the price of the dissolution of the IC-. The continuous tension that had hinged the energies of the masses in the USSR disappears, laying the political conditions for their transformation, already irreversible, from socialist to social imperialist. 92. In Western Europe, communism followed the downward line of the west wind. From the Petrograd of the October Revolution it reaches the Spartan Berlin, but, no matter how hard it tries, it fails to generate a revolution. This will stagnate in Germany and will only be able to contemplate, bewildered, how the hordes of fascist barbarism loom over it, just as they had done in Italy. Passing through France, it turns the PCF into the vanguard of the new populist front line to quickly reduce it to ineffectiveness, and reaches the dying Spanish Republic, where an exceptional situation allows the development of the Popular Front in all its splendor and the definitive exhaustion, consequently, of the theoretical and political premises of Bolshevism, which destroys the major state of the RPM and turns its sections into independent parties, free from the obligations derived from the statutes and resolutions of the Congresses of the IC. 93. Necessarily, it led to the reproduction of the imperialist status quo that emerged from the ashes of the Second World War and the happy incorporation of the European Communist parties to it. This is the conclusion of the side of history that we have examined in the present work. However, in the peasant East, that other half of the RPM, and symptomatically at the same times when the line of the Popular Front matured, grew and collapsed, the genuine universal military strategy of the proletariat, the prolonged People's War led by the Communist Party of China, was developed. Driven by the wind of the East, the CCP carries out, from its independent policy, a very broad war of national liberation against Japan, simultaneously fulfills the tasks of the bourgeois democratic revolution, which is, for that very reason, new democracy, and, with weapons in hand, forces the nationalist bourgeoisie to fight against the common enemy. 94. All this, solving it from the organic incorporation of the roaring masses of the peasant war to the revolution and its organization in the Eighth Army, commanded by the same CCP, and not by the nationalist state, which is progressively devoured by the state of revolutionaries. In this way, conventional warfare, aimed at the capture of strategic squares, is dismised in favor of a fluid war whose axis is the conquest of the masses, who are incorporated into the revolution through their participation in the war of national liberation. Only in this way can you understand feats such as the Long March and that the serious material sacrifices, territorial, political and human, that the PCC is experiencing do not abort the revolutionary process. Making the revolution to win the war, such is the slogan that the experience of the PCC inscribes in its flags, and that manages to turn the cracks through which the old state makes water into steps of the revolution and the dictatorship of the proletariat. As is known, the Chinese party faction led by Mao Zedong will only be able to articulate this alternative line by reinterpreting the directives of the IC. In other words, the PCC carries out the revolution not against, but outside the headquarters of the RPM. And this, although it was evident that what the Chinese communists were doing had little or nothing to do with the Popular Front, it could not but continue to provide its moral, logistical and material support to an undeniably revolutionary process, and that advances to sales deployed from 1935. As a counterpart, this mismatch between the general, populist front line of the IC and the effective practice of the Chinese Revolution will lead to a certain skepticism within the PCC towards the IC as an institution, indicative fact of the depth it had for the entire cycle. Thus, after the beginning of the Sino-Sovietian controversy, the Chinese communists will refuse to lead the international struggle against revisionism, justified in the particularity of the private affairs of each local Communist Party's idea, induced, probably, by the merger of the PCC with the Chinese National Revolutionary Movement, with all exclusive and exclusive prejudices that develop immediately with its consolidation as a state. The PCC will therefore enter the rag of the rules of play established by the world of the Cold War for international politics, assuming the subdivision of the world into states as a premise of its external projection and sponsoring the insurgent movements opposed to those that are breastfeeding Soviet revisionism. Under the historical circumstances of the moment, decolonization and democratic revolutions in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, this limitation of Maoism will degenerate into the Third World, and in the conditions of the closed cycle it could only become a denial of the universality of the People's War as a military strategy of the proletariat, which is, in turn, the denial of the possibility of organically welding the different fronts of the world revolution. 95. So profound is the historical defeat of the proletariat that, for the first time, the continuity and internationality of the revolution that awakens with the rise and conflagration of the Third State has been interrupted. 3.3. The Communist International before history, the history of emancipation, of the ideas and programs under which it had to be carried out, is traveled, undergroundly and sometimes diffusely, by the idea of the integral union of all humanity as the ultimate horizon, by the transgression of borders as a sine qua non condition of the kingdom of freedom. Usually, it would be religious consciousness that would shape this longing, and already the ancient world, in the run-up to its imperial decomposition, knew the proliferation of those mysterious cults of the East that offered the initiates the perspective of a royal community independent of the temporal powers and their territorial divisions. One of those cults would be Christianity. The cosmopolitan character of the empire in which he Medro favored, naturally, its assimilation as an official Roman religion, since the freedom it offered was worth as much for those who sit on the imperial throne as for those who are loaded with chains. However, the religious ideal would still have room to substantiate, over another millennium and a half, the more or less radical emancipatory aspirations in the medieval West, thus the Beguinas, the Hussites, the Fraticelli, the peasant revolts that took away the dream of the feudal lords during the late Middle Ages, from Central Europe to the western extreme of the known world, as a symptom of the crisis and stagnation of a mode of production that could not go beyond the spontaneous productivity of the earth. As is obvious to any Marxist, this religious form is due to the inability to find a real common nexus on which to base that old universal twinning of men. Only with the development of capital, which among other things implies the internationalization of all social relations, will the kingdom's thousand-year-old longing for freedom begin to be secularized. It is no coincidence that the Italian Renaissance comes to coincide with the beginning of what is known, among current historiographical currents, such as the First Globalization. To the Revolutionary Terror, which until then was limited to the space in which the insurgents had the direct capacity to act and for the time that the abuses of the lords lasted, was added the fear of contagion. The German Reform, the first rationalization of the modern capitalist consciousness, gave the United Provinces the excuse for their revolution against the Habsburgs, and from there the spark would jump to England, where an unusual revolutionary process would make heads roll. From the balance of this first cycle of bourgeois revolutions would emerge the Hobbes, the Locke's, and also the school of French materialism that would support the Enlightenment and the theories of the social contract, which are taken up by American settlers and put into practice during the War of Independence of the United States. The wind of the revolution jumps the puddle again, spreading through France the flames of a 1789, a 1792, and, especially, a 1793. From this moment on, and for approximately 2 centuries, the revolution will be established as a permanent backdrop in class struggles around the world, and there will be no sanitary cord tight enough to quarantine it for a long time. Within the framework of this directly international dimension of the revolution, the modern state, that is, bourgeois, also develops, in a necessary way, as a sphere located above social life and supposedly alien to it. Indeed, if the fundamental contradiction of the new mode of production, capitalism, is the contradiction between the growing socialization of production and the private appropriation of the social product, on the political level this is reflected in the need for a certain point of equilibrium that, preserving the revolutionary conquests, suppresses the revolution itself, that is, the extraordinary conditions under which the normal accumulation of capital and its guarantee by law is impossible. In this way, the bourgeois state and the rule of order and law within its borders rise on the liquefacy of internal customs and the liberalization of factors of production. In fact, it is the perspective of a class further to the left of the revolutionary bourgeoisie that, historically, has catalyzed the generation of political state mechanisms that allow to digest and assimilate the mass movement that capital brings to the world. With the still fresh memory of 1649, the English ruling classes, including the young but powerful capitalist class, built their modern parliament, a lasting solution to the secular bowel confrontations between their aristocratic faction and their monarchical faction, taking care that they did not exacerbate themselves again to the point of exploring a new civil war that, like that of the mid-century, summoned the threat of the levelers. In France, a thermidor and an empire were needed to channel, through the army, the newly unleashed energy of the masses to the outside, and the successive wars against absolutist Europe, and conjure the ghosts of Hébert and Babeuf. And, in the United States, the labor movement will only take off when the country's territory closes by the Pacific, bridging the margin that until then allowed the internal problems of the American state to be redirected to the conquest of the West, although not without important revolutionary crises, such as the one that served as a backdrop to the Civil War. These brief but representative examples are valid to illustrate how it was articulated, as the bay of the bourgeois revolution was exhausted, that basic contradiction that articulates the political network with which capital is endowed to exercise its domination and of what are, in turn, the basic pillars of the modern state. As the revolution sweeps away with the feudal structures of old Europe, setting new bourgeois states as successive links or nodes of the international trade networks in which they are politically rooted, the space of the youth internationalism of the bourgeoisie is also being filled. And it is that the law, the recognition of the private appropriation of the social product, is guaranteed in the territorialization of revolutionary conquests, as a static geographical spatial framework within which social peace can be imposed and capital can be politically stabilized, as a virtuous midpoint of the contradiction between the internationalization of all social relations and the necessary political stability that requires their accumulation. In fact, the sovereignty of the modern state is directly associated with the idea of the territory in which law governs in an intensive and homogeneous way, that formal, legal equality, which is the flag of war of the bourgeoisie against the ancien regime, is held in a spatial dimension that can only coincide with the entire state. A flag, in turn, that as soon as it has dominated the feudal spectra has already to be directed towards the neutralization of the new social forces that the bourgeoisie, without wanting to avoid it, has released. The primitive bourgeois state stands against those who possess nothing, and inerts the abstract legal equality as the social glue that twins the bourgeois and the proletarian, as the instance in which, apart from their private interests as economic figures, they find an element of generality. If under the absolutist state different jurisdictions and territorial rights coexisted in an amalgam that codified the legal status and fiscal duties of each individual according to their place of origin, or a state, the bourgeois state, by its own logic that abstract equalization of men establishes for the first time the direct identity between the political regime and its territory. As is known, territory is also one of the basic traits that define the nation, which is settled, precisely, with the stabilization of the bourgeois revolution, and not before. It is also, then, with the first definition of the links of the world division of labor, when the youthful internationalism of the bourgeoisie is succeeded by its senile counterpart, nationalism. It makes perfect sense, then, Stalin's dictum according to which commerce is the school in which the bourgeoisie learns nationalism, and the historical emergence of this is symptomatic of two definitely filled spaces. The geographical territorial, there are no longer physical spaces with special privileges located on the margins of the bourgeois state, which also begins to be the normal form of political articulation in old Europe and that of the bourgeoisie's ability to defend democracy. To the last consequences. It is in the 1830s that the first nationalist revolutions, the Belgian and the Greek, against the regime of the Congress of Vienna, took place, and it is also at this time that Mazzini, in Italy, defines for the first time what will be known as the principle of nationalities, one nation, one state. But in the same decade, parallel to this awakening of nationalisms, the air socialists of Babeuf organized the League of the Banished. Perhaps that name is the result of an election as naive as it is happy, but it faithfully represents the maturity of that class more to the left for this moment. In a bourgeois Europe in which modern territorial states are everywhere settled, what better name for the party of those who possess nothing than the landless, the homelandless, as declared profession of internationalist faith? Not long after, in that 1848 that marks the emergence of the proletariat as an independent political subject and the passage of the bourgeoisie to the reaction, Lamartine, involved in the Republican tricolor, would reject the red flag before the City Council of Paris. Let's make a leap to the time of imperialism. Extensively, the world has been divided into states, many of them, such as in the Middle East or Africa, designed with a squad and a sling, and all of it is governed under the vault of imperialism. Intensively, the bourgeois state, now imperialist, has deepened and rooted itself in its social soil through social democracy. The spontaneous movement of the no longer so young working class is integrated into the mechanisms of self-reproduction and improvement of the state. The balloon has been filled, inward and out. There are no more spaces on the sidelines and one can no longer be indifferent. It is time for the once exiled to become Bolsheviks and, finally, claim the world. As the first historical affirmation of the avant-garde moment, October was that explosion of subjectivity that, from the mountains of ruins of Tsarism, was launched on the world with an optimistic vocation to win it. His lack of accumulated journey, the orphanhood of a past as a class for himself in which he could recognize himself, conditioned that this first historical attack still needed to experience the bourgeois world, mediate with objectivity and its dynamics from its action as a revolutionary class. If the proletarian revolutionary project is historically made possible with the proliferation of capitalist relations in all countries and a more or less integrated economy worldwide, so that the economic conditions for communism are already given in all corners of the globe, its realization clashes with the necessary political segmentation of the bourgeois world in numerous states, with their unequal development and their respective particular political rhythms, a fact that bases the revolutionary elements and principle of the theory of socialism in a single country, synthesized precisely as a result of this first experience of clash with the political atomization of the imperialist world. It is the same circumstance that led Lenin to speak of imperialism as a system of states, and that had already been briefly analyzed by Marx, not fortuitously, when talking about the transition to communism. The current society is capitalist society, which exists in all civilized countries, more or less free of medieval additions, more or less modified by the particularities of the historical development of each country, more or less developed. On the contrary, the current state changes with the borders of each country. In the Prussian-German Empire it is different than in Switzerland, in England, another than in the United States. This radical exclusion of the different states is called into question, in a practical revolutionary way, by the RPM and the Communist International, by bringing together in the same revolutionary movement the dense, spontaneous, and international currents that agitated the subsoil of the bourgeois world, the struggle of proletarian classes in the West, the political awakenings of the peasant of the East, but also the massive incorporation of women into industry, for example. In this way, the Comintern, the World Communist Party, broke that curse that the state imposed on the mass movement by making it tend towards it. As October demonstrated, it was possible to go beyond the natural course of things, tear the masses out of the political framework of the spontaneous movement and the bourgeois state, and subjectively dynamize the currents that articulate the imperialist world below its surface, which only then enter history for the first time as subjective forces, or, more precisely, as organic parts of the proletarian universal subject. Indeed, I had hoved the old mole well. And it is that the imperialist state is built, like the state in general, on what the subject is leaving, in its heavy and hard-working advance, behind, in this case, on the working class with class consciousness itself, circumscribed to its resistance organisms at the moment when revolutionary Marxism asks who wants to make the revolution. Hence the permanent struggle of the Bolsheviks against the narrow Menshevik laborist closure, which aborts the universal emancipatory dimension of communism, and against economicism and, even more, against imperialist economicism, which replaces real politics, the link with the conjuncture, with perfectly assucible fatalistic and abstract reasoning, to say Lenin, by teachers who forget the elements of agitation and utopia of Marxism. 97. That is precisely the core of Lenin's criticism of Kautsky's ultra-imperialist theory in times of war, that disarms the proletariat because it forgets the living, real, contradictory politics and the will of the avant-garde to want to make the revolution, in exchange for the fluid, impersonal and dogmatically abstract tendency to the growing global economic interrelationship. 98. With the transition to imperialism, the spontaneous objectivity of class society exhausts its ability to contribute to historical progress, and the weight transits decisively towards the subject. It is with imperialism that the Marxist qualification of the state as parasitic excrescence takes on all its dimension, since it has definitely become an empty shell incapable of creating new historical substance, and that can only aspire to reorganize, in a reactionary way, those ruins that the subject, the only possible creative force in our time, is leaving behind. It is therefore no coincidence that, with the closure of the October cycle, the bourgeoisie has decreed the end of history, because indeed it has no choice but to recognize its complete bankruptcy to contribute anything new to humanity. In all fairness, we can say that the current world, postmodern, is nothing more than the gap that the October cycle has left after collapsing. The imperialist state that emerges in parallel to the cycle was nothing but the reaction to the movement of that old economic class, another carrier of progress, which was known as a pillar of capitalism, capable of stopping it if it wanted, and that goes on to sustain the welfare state as a dam of containment against communism. 99. The post-cycle imperialist state is the one that confronts and dialogues. with all those subjectivities that, having been splintered by communism that made them possible historically, spontaneously roam the world and flourish on the margins of the universal revolutionary subject, following precisely the example of the modern Union, and that are, therefore, substantive as partial figures, such as decolonization, third worldism, feminism, etc., all of them byproduct, residue, and reaction to the internationalist flash that starts with October 100, precisely, while their ultimate causes concern the depths of the bourgeois world and constantly violate state borders. They are integrated not only from the state, but also from the interstate political superstructures that the bourgeoisie is endowed with, organizations such as the UN, NATO, and the like, international forums or NGOs, and that are now shown to it as a need for survival. 101. In fact, the substitution, undoubtedly reactionary and unjustifiable from the point of view of the revolutionary proletariat, of the Comintern by the Cominform and the Warsaw Pact does nothing but reissue as a reactionary farce what had already happened in the 1920s, two world camps, that of authentic and revolutionary communism and that of capitalism, the World Front of Revolution and the World Front of Reaction, the Comintern and the League of Nations. And it is that so deep is the torrent of forces that October unleashed that, since then, the bourgeoisie, whether social imperialist or imperialist, can no longer dominate its world without permanent international organizations. A symptom that this class faces structural problems that are more directly global than ever, and that, in turn, has known how to tame and integrate all those spontaneous post-cycle movements, no matter how far down they are built and no matter how international they are presented. We are so far from the revolution and at the same time so close. The key lies in, effectively, being like the Bolsheviks, but without being the Bolsheviks. Today as then, that the extensive quantitative of the existing world already marked by the passage of the subject during the first cycle of the RPM is founded on the intensive qualitative of revolutionary communism, fertilized by the synthesis of the experience of that step, is the premise for the proletariat, as the Communist Party, to enter again into the historical proscenium, dynamizing it deep of our time, and that will be reflected, eventually, in the reconstitution of the Communist International that, resuming the path of the Three International, is erected in major state of the RPM, and that it will find in front of the system of states of imperialism and the spontaneous mass movements on which it relies. Then, each reconstituted Communist Party, every proletarian dictatorship born of the crisis consciously provoked in each state, will become a node, a base of support of a network lacking in a geographical, dynamic, flexible, rhizomatic center, if you like, that will not operate on the basis of territorial state criteria, but under the perspective of the conscious, continuous, and uninterrupted promotion of the RPM, from top to bottom, and whose premise is precisely the Communist International, as the only global platform capable of sustaining it and giving it a path to become complete communism. The immediate tasks towards this objective are the ideological reconstitution of communism and the reconstitution of the Communist Party, as a first step towards the military defeat of the bourgeoisie and the opening of the second cycle of the RPM, with the Communist International functioning as its headquarters. If the proletariat based in the Spanish state is able to fulfill this task, the front populist sins of its past will have been amply expiated. Committee for Reconstruction, October 2019.